A lot of meta frameworks today focus on the server, whether it be React server components, server side rendering, server actions, and so much more. But what about the highly interactive dynamic applications that still exist today and they still deserve all the performance benefits and the optimizations that all these meta frameworks provide? And that is where TanStack Start comes in play. TanStack Start is a framework that is built by Tanner Linsley, built on top of TanStack Router, TanStack Query, and so much more. It not only focuses on the service stuff, but also focuses on highly dynamic client side applications. So, in this specific video, let me give you an honest review of TanStack Start and how it compares to one of the most popular frameworks, Next.js. Let's take a look at where one shines over the other in this specific video. So, let's dive in. And thanks to Clerk for kindly sponsoring this video. So, to start off, what is TanStack Start? TanStack Start is a full stack React framework that's powered by TanStack Router. TanStack Router in the TanStack ecosystem is quite powerful. It powers the routing inside of TanStack Start as well. So if your first question is, well, when should you use TanStack Start versus Router? TanStack Start is a full stack framework. It not only allows you to focus on client side routing, but also server side routing as well. So that's something you need to keep in mind. TanStack Router out of the box does give you 100% inferred TypeScript support, type safe navigation. What that means is, let's say if you were to route to a route which does not exist, then TanStack Router is going to throw an error. It's going to tell you that, hey, this route does not exist. So you don't route to it, which will prevent you from routing to unnecessary places and resulting in errors for your users, which you don't want. TanStack Start and Router are both very powerful, and this is a really good diagram for you to understand the differences. TanStack Start provides all of these capabilities that TanStack Router does not. So, for instance, you get SSR and hydration, streaming, server functions, full stack type safety, and client side interactivity. Now, you do get client side type safety, but its TanStack Router is mainly for client side routing versus TanStack Start is mainly for full stack routing. Now, on the other hand, Next.js is a full stack React framework. Just like TanStack Start, it is also built on top of React, but it not only gives you client side routing, but also server side stuff as well. Next.js is quite powerful. It gives you all the bells and whistles needed to ship a really powerful application. But the docs make it very clear when you should use TanStack Start and when you should not. When should you not use it is when your site will be 100% static. If you have a fully static site, such as a blog, a documentation site, even like a lot of like e-commerce applications that don't necessarily need a lot of dynamicness, then in that case, TanStack Start might not be right for you. So let's if your site is 100% static, then in that case, you don't want to use TanStack Start. But that is where Next.js truly shines. If you are building an application that is 100% static and it has a lot of static content, then Next.js definitely shines there because of the different data fetching mechanisms that Next.js provides out of the box. If your goal is service rendered site with zero JavaScript or minimal client side interactivity, then in that case as well, TanStack Start is not a good fit for you. Like I said initially, TanStack Start is really good when you have a dynamic application because it truly focuses on that. But if your application doesn't have that, maybe pick some other framework like Next.js. If you are looking for a React Server component first framework, now, even though TanStack Start does have plans to implement this in the future, but for now, it does not support that. But if you are looking for React Server components, then you definitely want to use something like Next.js. In the Next.js app router, which is one of the two routers that Next.js has, by default, whenever you create a new file, a new component inside of Next.js, that component by default is a React Server component. So you get that benefit out of the box versus with TanStack Start, you don't have that. Having said that, if you have a highly dynamic application, then 100% using something like TanStack Start is the way to go because of its focus on that. So when you start to bootstrap your application, you have to install these dependencies. And that is where I want to talk about Vinci. Now, if you go to the Vinci's website, it is essentially a full stack JavaScript SDK. Whenever you want to build your own framework like TanStack Start did, then you want to use something like Vinci. It is very powerful, and you can read all about how it is a full stack JavaScript SDK that will allow you to build your own framework with your opinion, but just giving you the infrastructure necessary for it. So that Vinci is definitely really powerful. It is powered by Vinci and also TanStack Router, like I talked about. TanStack Router is being used currently in production by many companies, and it is very powerful. So having TanStack Start built on top of it is also really. Without further ado, let's take a look at the code. Now I have a repo set up for TanStack Start Starter app, and then I also have a Next.js app as well. Both have similar functionalities. One where you can add one and it increments the count. Same thing here as well. And this will give you a really good understanding of the two, and we can compare it as well to assess the pros and cons of each. So let's take a look at TanStack Start. So if we go through the files here, we have the app folder, and then we have all these different files. So let's take a look at it one by one. So first, let's take a look at router.tsx. This is where we create a router. And if you take a look, we use a function called as create TanStack router. It has this specific route tree, which is auto generated, which is why it has .gen. Then we also are providing what should happen if your specific route were to be not found, then what specific component would we provide here. And then we essentially create the router, and then we also declare the TanStack React router module here. So basically, whenever we start typing, and if we were to route to a route that doesn't exist, it will tell us. Then let's take a look at client.tsx. This is where we create the client side router itself. So if we take a look, if we go to create router, then this is where on the client side, the router gets created. On the other hand, if we go to SSR, then we also create the router here, but here we initialize it with create start handler function, which comes from TanStack Start itself. But this is the SSR file that enables all the server side rendering stuff. And this is all the client stuff, which is going to hydrate it to the specific start client component and mount the router here. Then let's take a look at the routes folder. This is where you would start defining all the routes necessary. Let's take a look at underscore underscore root file. Now, this is the main file that allows us to connect our entire page together. So, for instance, we have the root route and it has all the meta tags here. Then we have the root component, which is essentially this specific component. The root document is this specific function right here, which has the HTML and body tags. And then we have also added a header called as TanStack Start app with a main, which wraps the entire children. Any of the children that do come in from different routes are going to basically be the children of this specific root document. Then we have the scripts component as well as meta tags as well from TanStack Start 2. But if we were to scroll up, we also have a outlet file too. And this specific outlet file allows us to essentially mount that specific router code, the route code in that specific location. And you're going to see outlet in other places as well, wherever we need it. In fact, if you have used just React router before, then you will also see outlet there as well. All right, so that is the root file here. And anytime we were to create a new route, it uses a file system based routing as well. So what we can do is index.tsx becomes the index route, which is what you see here. Don't worry about all these other functions. We'll take a look. What we want to focus on is this file. So whenever you want to expose a specific route, that is expose the file as a route, then you need to use a function called as create file route. It has the component, and it also has this concept called loaders. Wherever you need something that needs to be prefetched for that specific route to function correctly, you can specify in the loader, and then we can just use route.useLoaderData, which is the get count itself, which basically fetches the count for us from here. And then this button executes the code later. We'll take a look at that in a second. But this is how you can provide data beforehand as the route is loading, and then use that router data later on. If you want to create a dynamic route, all you need to do is the name of that route dot this dollar sign post id.tsx. This dollar sign is going to make it a dynamic route. So you can just route to slash post slash whatever, and this becomes a dynamic route. Similarly, since we want to expose this route as a public route, we are saying create file route here. And then this time the loader is getting the post by ID. It's invoking the post by ID function and then fetching that data in advance so that the post component can use it. And then we're just simply displaying the post or data. So for instance, if we go to slash post here, then you can see all the posts here. And then when I click on the post, then you can see the post necessary as well. If you take a look at the post component, same idea. We have the loader which get all the posts, so all these different posts. We're saying it's going to be on slash post, which and the component is going to be post component. Use loader data through all the posts and displaying it. But the reason why it's showing it on the right hand side is because of this outlet component here that I talked about, which comes from React TanStack React router itself. So it's going to show any of the child route of posts right there. Lastly, if you take a look at route3.gen.ts file, the minute you run your development server, this is automatically going to be generated. This is what tells TanStack Start, hey, what are the routes that exist and what should happen when, essentially. All right, so that's essentially the overview of the file system of TanStack Start. Now, if you were to take a look at Next.js, this is the Next.js app. Same idea, it has a counter with a state variable as well. At the same time, if you go to slash posts, then it displays a list of all the posts. And when you click on individual posts, it also displays the specific title of that post too. So in Next.js, we are using the app router. And the way Next.js works is you need to create a file called as page.tsx for it to be exposed as an index file. This is what's happening here. We are displaying it. Whoops, we are displaying it. Here we are reading the count and then we are showing the state variable, which is this specific value right here. Then we have the layout.tsx file, similar to how we saw in TanStack. For instance, this specific header is in fact here. Same idea here too. We have the layout file that wraps your entire application, and the children are all the child routes that are there in your app. Then, in order for you to create a new route inside of Next.js, you need to create a folder called as posts, and then inside of that, page.tsx. Similarly, if you want to create a dynamic route, then you just use the box bracket, which page.tsx file again. Again, similar idea, we are displaying it all here. But the difference is that all these files right here are in fact server components, which the functionality for that doesn't exist yet inside of TanStack Start, but it is coming very soon because remember that it's still in beta. But on the Next.js side of things, all these files are in fact React server components. But if you want to make a specific component a client component, that means if your application has interactivity and so on, then in that case, you need to mark that component a use client component. Now, in this case, the button here is in fact a client component. Why? Because it has a click handler, which again in TanStack Start, we don't have to do it because in TanStack Start, we don't have to do it because all these files are in fact client side rendered itself with server side rendering capabilities as well. So one of the strengths of the TanStack ecosystem in general, but specifically TanStack Start and Router, are its API design. For instance, you want to expose a route, then you use a function called as create file route, which gets exposed from the router. If you want to create a root route, which we saw, then you just they expose a create root route function from the router. Again, it's so simple that anytime you want something, you can they expose a function and you can simply use it by abstracting all the complexity for us. Similarly, if you were to think about server functions in TanStack Start, if you were to take a look at if you were to go to server functions allow you to specify logic that can be invoked anywhere, even the client, but they only run on the server. They are very similar because they are also async functions that are executed on the server. But the API design is far superior inside of TanStack Start than it is in Next.js. Here's why. First of all, the docs make it super clear that they're not publicly accessible by HTTP, which Next.js does as well. They can be called from anywhere in your app, including loaders, hooks, components, etc. And I think this specific line that they can be called from anywhere in your app is where I would say TanStack Start shines, because in Next.js, depending on where you call that specific server action, you might get into trouble there, because it definitely has a much more stricter API design that you cannot just call server actions from wherever you like. So if you were to take a look, how are server functions different from React server functions? Well, TanStack server functions are not tied to any specific front-end framework, which means you can use with any front-end framework of your choice. On the other hand, TanStack server functions are backed by standard HTTP requests and can be called as often as you like without suffering from serial execution bottlenecks. So it doesn't matter where exactly you call them, TanStack is going to work on extracting that specific server logic out so it doesn't get included in your bundle. And the server functions on the client are modified to remove server only logic out of the client bundle as well, like I talked about. And it replaced with a function that, when called, makes a fetch request to the server, instructing it to execute the server function in the server bundle, and then sending the response back to the client. So if you want to create a server function inside of TanStack Start, again, all you need to do is use this function called as create server function, and that's it. And then this specific code is going to get abstracted out. And it also comes with specific requirements that if you are using a get request, then use an HTTP verb get. So for example, here instead of server time, we're saying get server time. Let's take a look at the code for server functions. So for instance, if you go back to the app, we are using a server function here, in fact. If you click on add, then it's going to increment the count for 39. We're storing this value inside a file system, so this is 39. So the way it works is if we go to index.tsx file, if you saw, we have this function called as create server function that creates a server function for a get request for reading the count. Reading the count, it's basically going to read the file system count file, which is count.tsx file, and then give us that value. Similarly, if you want to update the count, that means that's why we're using the word update, which is an HTTP verb. The method is going to be post, and the handler is basically going to write it to the file. And now, when you have to use it, all you need to do is update count, and then you can invoke the router directly, which comes from use router, which comes from TanStack React router itself, and then you can invalidate any cache that exists. So it looks like it's dynamic and it's instant. For instance, if I do +1, then the state changes to 40. But let's say if I remove this code and if I do +1, nothing's going to happen. But if I bring this code back, suddenly it's 42. And that's what I mean by that. But if you look at the API design, it's pretty slick. These functions are going to be abstracted out completely because they are server functions, and the client will basically call the server bundle. And the server bundle is going to look at the functions. Hey, do I have this function called as up count or get count and so on, and then execute it and return the response accordingly. So it's actually pretty simple because of this. On the other hand, if you were to use, on the other hand, in Next.js, it is also quite simple, but there are some architectural gotchas you need to know of because of how it works with React Server components as well. If you were to go to page.tsx, same idea. We have the state right here. If I increment the count, it changes to 47, and we are storing it in count.txt file as well. Now we are printing the state here, but then we have to abstract the count button out. Why? And make it a client component. Why? Because this has client functionality. So Next.js definitely thrives with directives, which is use client. And again, granted, this comes from React. If you expose this specific file as use client, then only it's going to get exposed to the browser. Otherwise, it's not going to. Whereas with TanStack, you expose a server function and everything is client only. So that's definitely something you need to keep in mind. Now, the button is calling a function called as update count, and it's incrementing by 1. But if you were to go to update count, this is in another file called as use server. Now, use server directive, we don't need use server here because we have use server here. Use server directive is going to expose all the functions in this specific file and expose them as HTTP methods. So for instance, this is going to expose this function and create a post endpoint for it, for instance. And this is why it means that use server is just literally going to make all these functions inside this file as server actions. Now, because of the magic that happens underneath it, it's really difficult to really know that this specific function is in fact going to get exposed. There are specific rules that you need to follow so that it works. The other thing is, now in order for us to read count from here, this is a server component, so which is basically reading the count and displaying the count on the page. Now, if you were to expose this, copy this, and move it inside a count server actions file, for instance, right here, if we were to copy this and paste it here, this is not going to work. Why? This is going to work, but this is going to expose a security risk. Why? Because now this specific function has been exposed as a get endpoint, and because of this, you have accidentally exposed something that you don't really want to expose. Now, obviously, count is not as sensitive, so it doesn't really matter, but you might end up exposing things that you don't really intend to with this specific function. So, this is something you need to keep in mind. Anytime you want export something inside of this specific file is going to get exposed on an HTTP endpoint. So, something to keep in mind here. So, I'm gonna keep this code as is and then go back to having read count inside of server component. So we call read count here in the home file. Then then we declare a count button function which needs to be extracted out. Why? Because it's a client component. And then inside of that, we need to invoke the server action, which needs to have a directive called use server, and then it's going to read the count and increment it. Now, obviously, the design for this is a lot simpler. You create a server function with method post, which makes it really obvious that this is going to get exposed as an HTTP endpoint versus the other way around inside of Next.js. So definitely a fan of the API design of TanStack Start. Then TanStack also has a really cool TypeScript system. So with this specific validator function, you can validate the parameters that are going to come into the server function. For instance, now when it comes to the validator function in TanStack Start gives you runtime type safety and validation, which means you can check what the type of that specific value is. For instance, here person is of type unknown. So you can check if it's not an object or if it's null, then person must be an object. You can throw an error. Similarly, if there is name in person and type of name property inside of person is not a string, then you can throw a error saying person.name must be a string. And then you can also cast the person as person, which is of type person with name as string, and then only will it pass it to the handler. This additional layer of type safety is really good, especially when your application is highly dynamic. You have maybe you have a lot of different form fields, or you have in general a lot of validation that you need to make before your application can hit the server endpoint, and this makes your life so much simpler because of this additional layer of validation. So one of the weaknesses of TanStack Start as of now is that it doesn't have React Server Components support yet, but it's coming up. It's still in beta, so we need to keep that in mind. Versus with Next.js, that's not the case. You can start using Next.js in production, and it does have React Server Components support itself, along with server actions as well. If you were to think about when you should use TanStack Start versus Next.js, for instance, you want to use TanStack Start whenever you have a highly dynamic application, which focuses a lot on the client. But you also need the bells and whistles necessary, such as server-side rendering and all the fun stuff, such as server functions and so on, just to still be able to get the performance optimizations as well as the developer productivity that you would get with all these optimizations and layers on top that other meta frameworks provide, such as Next.js. But if you have a static site, if majority of your site is static, you really care a lot about static content, then definitely go for Next.js, because Next.js will shine there. And Next.js has so many different capabilities that really focuses on static data that you don't necessarily need to worry about. And it's giving you more and more granular caching controls with later versions that is going to make your life a lot simpler and give you that control that you need with all your static data. Versus if you have a highly dynamic application, the definitely TanStack Start is the way to go. And lastly, to answer the question, why should you care about TanStack Start when you have frameworks that already do a lot? For example, Next.js, Remix, and so many other frameworks that already exist today. Well, because one, TanStack ecosystem is very powerful. It has already served millions of developers with React query or like TanStack query. TanStack Start is just the beginning, but we also have TanStack router, TanStack table, and all the things that are available inside of the TanStack ecosystem, which have time and time again proven how different they are. And with so many different downloads on npm, they definitely cannot be ignored. It's also created by Tanner Linsley, which if you haven't already checked out my channel, then definitely check out the interview where I interviewed Tanner, and he talks a lot about TanStack in general and the ecosystem of TanStack as well. But that's also another reason why you should care. The second reason why you should care about is because client-side applications these days are definitely ignored, in my opinion. I feel like we focus so much on the server, but what about highly dynamic applications that still exist today? Also, if you are in a company or team that cannot upgrade, that cannot just switch frameworks, or they still want to stick with the traditional SPA model that we had, that is single page application model that we had, what should you do? How can you leverage the benefits of all the latest and greatest that React has to offer? And not only that, just in general, the web has to offer. Then in that case, you would want to opt into something like TanStack because it really enables you and gives you all the bells and whistles necessary to build a really powerful dynamic application, which other meta frameworks do focus on, but a lot of focus is on the server. So definitely check out TanStack and TanStack Start in general, but also keep in mind that it is still in beta. So there's a lot more exciting stuff that's coming up with TanStack Start that you should keep an eye on. But in the meanwhile, Next.js is also quite powerful. It is one of the first, it's one of the first frameworks that enable React server components, and it has all the bells and whistles necessary to ship a production ready application. I recently also created a course on Next.js as well at nextjscourse.dev. So if you haven't already, definitely check it out as well. And you can sign up to that until Friday. There is a 50% off discount as well. But on the other hand, Next.js is really powerful, and I have shipped so many different applications with Next.js. And because Next.js does do a lot out of the box for you, you do get a lot of performance optimizations that other frameworks don't provide. Next.js also has a lot of different components, such as the image component that gives you a lot of performance optimizations out of the box. It has form component that specifically handles prefetching of routes. There's a link component that handles client side navigation. There's a script component that allows you to import your external scripts and so on. All of these really make the framework really powerful as well. So definitely something you shouldn't ignore. But if you were to compare that to TanStack, TanStack does not have a form component or an image component that focuses mainly on images or forms in general, but it does have a link component that you can use to route to link between different pages and so on. But again, both frameworks have their pros and cons. And for your next application or even for your existing application, evaluate how dynamic your application is, what your use case is, and accordingly go for the right framework. Thank you so much for checking out this specific video. If you like this video, then definitely check out the interview on my channel where I interviewed Tanner Linsley, the creator of the TanStack ecosystem, on how TanStack started, the architectural decisions that he had to make, and how it has evolved into this powerhouse of different tools that developers use today. So definitely check it out if you haven't already. If not, I also have a bunch of different videos on my channel, so definitely consider subscribing. All right, bye for